Good morning. My name is Dr. Mushira Anis, and I would like to welcome all of our distinguished guests to our first annual International Down Syndrome Colloquium. Our conference today is the first step in many to follow as part of the partnership between the University of South Dakota and التغير Center in Bahrain. Before I get into explaining and talking about the theme for our conference today, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Usama Madbouli, the director of التغير Center, without whom this event would not be possible. Please allow me to thank our partners, the Bahraini Ministry of Health, the University of Bahrain, دراسة online center forums, an amazing platform of support to parents and caregivers, and Down Syndrome Dream, a novel initiative created by parents to empower parents, caregivers, and individuals with Down syndrome. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Egyptian Pharmaceutical Student Federation. Allow me to extend my thanks to my wonderful colleagues, Professor Patty Burke, Professor Shauna Cerny, Professor Julie Johnson, and Vanessa Anderson-Smith. When I presented this idea of an international conference and collaboration a few months ago, they jumped at the opportunity and really contributed their expertise and their knowledge, their extensive knowledge about the various topics we are discussing today. All of the presenters today are faculty members or graduates of the University of South Dakota. The University of South Dakota is the state's flagship university. It's a liberal arts university dedicated to liberal arts education through a multitude of accredited undergraduate and graduate degrees. The theme for our conference today fulfills the University of South Dakota's commitment to inclusiveness and diversity. The first few years in the life of the child with Down syndrome are very, very critical. Many, as you all know, face delays in many areas of development, and implementing an early intervention program that provides therapy and activities designed specifically to address the unique needs of the child with Down syndrome. I must say, the unique needs of the individual child. No child will be the same. Each child will have very, very specific needs in terms of early intervention. When you design an early intervention program that is tailored to the needs of the child, you ensure optimal outcomes. Throughout the conference today, we will discuss specific aspects of early intervention strategies that are usually utilized in Down syndrome. We are focusing today on aspects of physical therapy, sensory therapy, oral motor therapy, speech therapy, and the use of orthotics in children with Down syndrome. To begin our conference today, I will start with our first presentation. The title for our first presentation is Essential Building Blocks for the Successful Management of Trisomy 21. My objectives for today is to move beyond a deficit-based model that we've used for years when dealing with disabilities in general. We need to move beyond a deficit-based model to a model that builds families and people up. We will discuss best practices when delivering a diagnosis of Trisomy 21. We will also discuss the critical components of medical care for individuals with Trisomy 21, and I will emphasize thyroid health, a very important topic that I'm very passionate about. We will also discuss importance and components of early intervention. A little bit about me. I'm a child psychiatrist. I am a faculty member at the University of South Dakota. I'm an assistant professor with the Department of Health Sciences. I'm the co-founder of a number of non-governmental organizations that work closely with families and individuals with Down syndrome and autism and other disabilities. Working closely with families to provide support and medical interventions as needed is my passion. And my research interests include a variety of topics, including student motivation and learning environments, attachment theory, cross-cultural research, Down syndrome, and autism. I'm a firm believer of parent empowerment, specifically mother empowerment. A lot of the burden of care falls on the shoulders of mothers, and when we empower the mothers by giving them the much needed critical knowledge and cutting edge tools and technologies to use with their children, the results are going to be phenomenal. So let's talk about this paradigm shift that we see in the field of disability studies and what we know about Down syndrome that really emphasizes that paradigm shift. So we all know that Down syndrome is one of the most common genetic conditions in which an error in translation of chromosome 21 happens, resulting in 3 copies instead of 2. That means there's excess genetic material on the extra chromosome, leading to a variety of manifestations and a variety of medical conditions that accompany a diagnosis with Down syndrome. 1 in every 691 children born annually will have Down syndrome, making it the most common genetic condition. So what do we know about people living today who have Down syndrome? We know that people, kids and individuals with Down syndrome are not the same. They show a variety and a spectrum of abilities. There's a saying that I really like to emphasize when I talk about autism, and I think it lends itself very well when we talk about the child with Down syndrome. If you see a child with autism, you've only seen one child with autism, meaning that every child on the autism spectrum is going to be very, very unique to other children. The same principle applies to children with Down syndrome. We cannot use a broad brush to paint a similar picture when talking about children with Down syndrome. Each individual child will have strengths, will have abilities, and also will have areas where there's weaknesses, and we need to work on these weaknesses together as a team. Individuals with Down syndrome show a range of emotions. So this is not dependent on the condition. Individuals with Down syndrome are not happy all the time. They show anger, frustration, joy, happiness as everyone else. Life expectancy for the individual with Down syndrome has increased dramatically. So the average life expectancy as of today is 58.6 years of age, and this number is actually increasing as we speak because of the variety of advances in health care. The medical advances in the area of genetics provide a wealth of opportunity to improve quality of life. We have different Trisomy 21 research groups that have already identified candidate genes that are potentially involved in the formation of specific Down syndrome features. These advances in turn may help develop targeted medical treatments for persons with Trisomy 21. Many are advancing today, and many are being proposed. We currently have a mouse model for Down syndrome, and this has been used in research of Alzheimer's, specifically Alzheimer's disease research, and a lot of the findings from that research can be implemented to the population with Down syndrome. People with Down syndrome contribute to their families, their schools, their co-workers, their employers, and society. And many, many adults with Down syndrome attend college, have jobs, or marry. we need to really emphasize that people don't suffer from Down syndrome. In a study conducted by Brian Scott Co., 99% of adults with Down syndrome reported that they were very happy with their lives. In the same study, only 5% of parents reported feeling embarrassed by their child with Down syndrome. On the contrary, 99% of parents report that they love their son or daughter with Down syndrome. 97% report that they're proud of their son or daughter with Down syndrome, and 79% felt that their outlook on life was more positive because of their child with Down syndrome. When we look at siblings of children who have Down syndrome, 97% of brothers and sisters aged 9 to 11 said that they love their sibling. It's reported in the research that siblings are more compassionate, are well-adjusted, and parents themselves report that about 95% of time their sons or daughters without DS have good relationships with their siblings with Down syndrome. Unfortunately, more common than not, these positive aspects of Down syndrome are not part of the diagnosis delivery process. So what do parents report, and what can we change? What can we do to change what the parents report currently? Some of the best research in this particular area, the area of how to deliver a diagnosis of Down syndrome, is done by Dr. Brian Scott Co. He's a board-certified medical geneticist and co-director of the Down syndrome program at Massachusetts General Hospital. He himself is a sibling to Krista, an adult with Down syndrome. One of the amazing books out there that he co-authored is Common Threads. I encourage you all to try to get a copy of this book. It's a book that celebrates the life of many individuals with Down syndrome, emphasizing their abilities and their contributions. In his work, Dr. Scott Co. asked almost 3,000 mothers who have children with Down syndrome to report on their experiences and how doctors delivered a diagnosis of Down syndrome. Stories were sensitively honest and offered a lot of insight into this often neglected area. So a central question was posed to the mothers. How would medical support have been better when you received the diagnosis of Down syndrome for your child? What are some of the emotions that you experienced when you first heard the diagnosis? So a lot of the mothers reported feelings of being depressed, devastated, helpless, frightened, anxious, shocked. And then when the diagnosis was delivered, they felt that a lot of the information that was shared made them feel overwhelmed. A lot of the information was outdated, was insensitive, and sometimes incorrect. The majority of mothers felt that their physicians failed to discuss the positive aspects of Down syndrome and that they focused on the negative aspects when delivering the diagnosis. Some mothers found that the information they received, again, was insensitive, incorrect, and unnecessary. Based on this research, we have a number of recommendations that mothers and fathers contributed and suggested. So our main goal today is to really implement and talk about how to, or best practices in delivery of its Down syndrome diagnosis. First and foremost, remember, a baby is born. So congratulate the parents. This is a celebration of a new life. Congratulations are due. And a lot of the mothers state that they would rather have their obstetrician with whom they have a relationship that extended throughout the prenatal care period, deliver the diagnosis. Other mothers noted that they would prefer a pediatrician delivering the diagnosis with experience and knowledge about Down syndrome. So that was kind of the theme. They want a physician who is knowledgeable about the condition and can answer questions accurately and to the point. They also indicated that it's most helpful when the different specialists work together. Thus, an implementation of an interdisciplinary team approach is instrumental during this time. Mothers in Skotko's research reported that they received the diagnosis from a variety of healthcare providers, pediatricians, neonatologists, obstetricians, genetic counselors, nurses, and in some cases, lactation specialists and a volunteer at the hospital. Sometimes the mothers reported that physicians would inform the father, and then the burden of delivering the diagnosis to the mother would fall on the other parent's shoulder. So when do we want to deliver the diagnosis? Please use your best judgment. We do not want to elongate the period of waiting, so we need to deliver the diagnosis as soon as possible, and we don't want to wait for the karyotyping. So Down syndrome is relatively easy to diagnose based on the facial features and based on some of the characteristics that the child will show. Once we suspect that the child has Down syndrome, we need to inform the mother, but we need to make sure that the mother has been settled in and stabilized. Some mothers actually reported receiving the diagnosis immediately right after birth while their episiotomies were being stitched. So this is kind of up to the physician, up to the obstetrician or the geneticist or the pediatrician delivering the diagnosis. We want to make sure that the mother is stable enough, and we want to make sure that the period of silence is not elongated beyond what is needed. You need to deliver the diagnosis to both parents, the mother and father, and this has to be done privately with no visitors, no other medical personnel, no other patients in the room. And then we really want to focus on this, that the diagnosis of Down syndrome is as novel to the father as it is to the mother. And we should not, as physicians, expect that the fathers are the ones that share the news with the mothers. We want to emphasize that there is no specific reason behind Down syndrome. It's no one's fault. It's not the mother's fault. It's not the father's fault. We want to provide sound medical opinion. We don't want to provide any outdated information. Definitely, we need to provide some information. So delivering the diagnosis and just leaving is not going to cut it. So we want to provide accurate, sound medical opinion. Please use neutral language. That's very important. So instead of saying things like, "I'm so sorry, I have bad news," we can just say, "I have the results of the karyotyping. I have the results of the echocardiogram." So please be as neutral as possible. Don't share any personal opinions with your patients. Just share sound medical advice based on the up-to-date information and research. Please remember that the mothers will always remember the first words that you as their physician will say and use. Emphasize the positive positives of Down syndrome, but also remain accurate in your description. You can say things like, almost all children with Down syndrome will reach their milestones. They're going to be we expect them to be a little delayed than typically developing children, but they will reach their milestones. Mothers in Skotko's research indicated that they want 3 specific questions answered. What is Down syndrome? What are the causes of Down syndrome? What are the implications of having a family member with Down syndrome? So be ready to answer these questions accurately and to the point, to the best of your ability. After answering these 3 questions, we want to supplement our answers with resources, with actual resources. So complimentary copies of books on Down syndrome are appreciated, and that include positive imagery of children with Down syndrome at play, with peers, crawling, engaging with their parents, would provide a very powerful resource. And then we might be able to provide a bibliography of resources that the parents can purchase on their own. We want to provide contact information for local organizations, confidential, non-directive trained support for new and expectant parents need to be on staff, on part of the interdisciplinary team. And we want to provide connections to support community. So other families maybe other families from your own practice that are willing to be a support system to newly diagnosed parents. So providing all of this information really provides our parents with a solid foundation to start their journey. A word of caution here. Sometimes we can go overboard with our helpful resources. We might give the parents a number of books, a number of community resources, contact information, but then we want to sit down with our patients and really emphasize 1 or 2 things they want to really concentrate on during the first few months of the child's life. One of the best advices you can give your patient is to go home and enjoy their child. Enjoy their child as if it did not have Down syndrome, because the child, he or she, is no different from other children, from other babies. They need to be taken care of, they need to be cuddled, they need to be fed, changed, and most of all, loved by their parents. Moving on, what are some of the important medical issues that we should not overlook in the management and care of the child with Down syndrome? Once a diagnosis of Down syndrome is suspected, first and foremost, and before drawing blood for karyotyping, we need to immediately perform an echocardiogram. Every child born with Down syndrome has a 50% chance of having a form of heart defect or cardiac malformation. This echocardiogram needs to be read by a pediatric cardiologist, and we need a referral to a pediatric cardiologist as soon as possible. Once a postnatal echocardiogram results are flagged as abnormal. This is the most important piece in the medical care of individuals with trisomy 21, ensuring that the cardiac condition is fine. If not, refer to the cardiologist and ensure that there is optimal care being given and necessary care is being given for that condition. I cannot emphasize this enough. As we are drawing blood to do the karyotyping. We need to draw samples to run a complete blood count and a complete thyroid panel. And of course, the karyotyping. One of the easiest ways, one of the newest technologies, the FISH, fluorescent in situ hybridization technology, should be available. This provides results within 24 to 48 hours, and it only indicates that there is an extra copy of chromosomes, of chromosome 21 is actually present. It cannot detect translocations. Therefore, a positive FISH test should be confirmed by a complete chromosome analysis to identify translocations. But nonetheless, having results within 24 hours to 48 hours is really offers a lot of relief to the parents. When we do the CBC, we're trying to exclude, or we are excluding some hematological abnormalities that are common in the child with Down syndrome. And of course, when running the thyroid panel, we are looking for congenital hypothyroidism, something that we will discuss later on in more details. Identification of feeding problems. As we all know, the infant with Down syndrome has almost every child born with Down syndrome will have some form of hypotonia, and they will be sometimes exhibit slow feeding, sometimes they will exhibit choking while feeding, and we really need to follow that up and provide necessary feeding therapy and feeding consultation to the parents. We want to exclude any gastrointestinal problems. We want to exclude congenital hearing loss, and by doing a hearing screening, and we want to exclude congenital cataracts by doing a vision screening as well. Let's move on to discussing hypothyroidism. And this is something I'm very passionate about. I've been doing a lot of research in this area, and a lot of personal research in this area. And many times, the parent of the child with Down syndrome will present to us as medical personnel and healthcare providers with a number of symptoms that they've noticed that their child with Down syndrome exhibits. And unfortunately, a lot of us have a mindset that this is normal because the child has Down syndrome. So the dull look, the puffy face, the thick tongue that sticks out, these are all things that we think about when we diagnose a child with Down syndrome. The child having choking episodes, constipation, dry brittle hair, low hairline, poor feeding, short height, sleepless or sleepy all the time, sluggish, the hypotonia or floppy baby, dry skin. These are all symptoms of severe hypothyroidism. And I hope you guys can see the crossover between some of these, almost all of these symptomatologies, and some of our really essential features when we diagnose Down syndrome. This is an area of research that you will find a lot of conflicting research, but it's something to think about. Are we really looking closely at the thyroid? We need to run a full thyroid panel that includes TSH, free T3, free T4 to exclude the presence of any thyroid abnormality. As I said before, as I mentioned before, the research is a bit conflicting in terms of percentages of individuals with Down syndrome who have thyroid problems. You're going to read anywhere from 0% to up to 60% prevalence in some of the research, bringing the average to a little over 20%, making thyroid disease the most frequent endocrine abnormality in children with Down syndrome. So let's take a look at the reasons behind the higher rates of thyroid disease. So whether you're looking at hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, there's an increased risk for both conditions in the population with Down syndrome. As we all know, one of the biggest physiological obstacles that face the individual with trisomy 21 is oxidative stress. And the reason behind that is overexpression of the gene responsible for the enzyme superoxidase dismutase, SOD1, which is coded on chromosome 21. This results, and let me emphasize that the overexpression of this specific gene happens in almost 50% of our population with Down syndrome. This results in an increase of reactive oxygen species, ROS, due to the overproduction of hydrogen peroxide, leading to an end result of oxidative damage of DNA, proteins, and lipids. Thus, oxidative stress may play a role that is very important in the overall pathogenesis of Down syndrome. The oxidative stress may play a role in both hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. And additional studies show that a lot of the individuals with trisomy 21 are deficient in selenium, causing an impairment in the activity of phenylalanine hydroxylase and overexpression of DYRK1A kinase. However, many aspects that are crucial for the health and well-being of people with Down syndrome are still require further research. So all of this data is preliminary, but it's necessary to look closely at and consider when looking at thyroid health. So what can we do to improve thyroid health? Make sure that you're running the full panel. Look into running the reverse T3 for your patients and monitor the thyroid closely based on the clinical picture, not only the lab results. So this concludes taking care of the medical aspect of Down syndrome. Finally, I would like to emphasize and talk a little bit about the early intervention programs. So as we all know, children with Down syndrome go through the same stages of development as any typical child. The difference that compared to their peers, it will take the child with Down syndrome longer to achieve milestones. Things like rolling over, sitting, crawling, walking, jumping, running will happen, but it will happen in a much delayed fashion when compared to typically developing child. So how can we support the child with Down syndrome in a way that will provide an optimal environment for development? I consider breastfeeding the #1 early intervention strategy that mothers need to implement. The picture that you see here is based on MRI images coming out of the Brown University Baby Imaging Lab. So while the babies were asleep, MRI imaging of their brains were taken. These images show the development of myelinization in each child And definitely you can see the impact that breastfeeding has on the myelinization of the brain. Not only that, but breastfeeding offers amazing opportunities to practice oral motor therapy with our children because of how they exercise the mouth, the tongue, the jaw muscles are all involved in breastfeeding. Early intervention is backed by years of research. It is the most effective intervention. And when assessing the child with Down syndrome, we need to have an interdisciplinary team that involves a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, an early childhood teacher, and a nutritionist, a speech therapist, a speech language pathologist, someone who's trained in oral motor therapy, feeding therapy. These individuals need to assist the child. We might add to the interdisciplinary team as needed, as depending on the individual child's needs. And then these individuals put together an individualized plan that is tailored to the specific needs of the child. We need to empower the parents through early intervention, giving them techniques and giving them a chance to work with the child one-on-one every single day. Kids who are offered early intervention will show improved overall outcomes and will have greater independence in daily living activities as young children and then later on as adults. They will have improved social skills, and later on they will be ready for an inclusive learning environment in which the child with Down syndrome is learning from their peers, but also typical children will learn from the child with Down syndrome. The research is telling us that typical children learn about diversity, about friendship, about kindness, about inclusivity from an early age when they are in an inclusive environment with children with Down syndrome and other disabilities. So the conclusion of my talk today is that we need to have a committed, well-organized healthcare team that can greatly help during the first few days of receiving the diagnosis. These first few days are very, very critical to the overall outcomes, how the parents will approach approach working with their child, how long they will spend in going through grief. We can really facilitate that process if we have a well-organized approach, well-organized interdisciplinary approach put into place. Thyroid health is central to the overall optimal function and well-being of the child with Down syndrome. We need to be aware of that, and we need to be very prudent in how we diagnose and treat thyroid. And an early start of early intervention services should be emphasized to the parents and encouraged, and resources to early intervention. We as physicians need to be aware of our community resources of early intervention, and we need to offer that to the parents as a very powerful tool. This concludes my talk today about the early building blocks in the management of Trisomy 21. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being great listeners.